I want to thank Fran and Anne and June for this wonderful occasion. It's been years since I've looked forward to giving a presentation like this. I go to about 5 or 6 conferences a year, and I can't remember being this excited about coming somewhere to present a paper. So thank you very much, and it's been a real experience thus far. I arrived here in 1973. In September of 1973, Richard Nixon was in the throes of Watergate. Salvador Allende had just been overthrown in a violent coup in Chile. Bill Davis was beginning his very long and tedious journey as the Premier of Ontario. Deliberately, I should say. He was deliberately bland Bill. And here in Ottawa, Pierre Trudeau was getting used to the idea of running a minority government supported by the NDP, led at the time by David Lewis, who, after 1974, could be seen wandering the tunnels of Carleton when he took a professorship here. Also at Carleton, beginning his second year as president, was the renowned Michael Oliver, who had been federal president of the NDP, among many other things, prior to his coming here. And his wife, Joan, would soon begin a degree in this department. I arrived at St. Patrick's College in 1973, which had just moved that very summer from its old campus on Echo Drive to its new building on the Carleton campus. Already there were rumors that Carleton University would eventually close St. Patrick's College. Apparently they only just wanted the School of Social Work, which it actually did in 1979, but I'm getting ahead of myself. As the first person in my family to go to university, does this sound familiar? And the only person in my family who would ever obtain a degree of any kind, never mind 3 of them, I had really no idea what I was getting into. With some vague notions of intellectuals and hippies populating university campuses, I arrived totally unprepared. But I had come on the advice of the Oblate Fathers, who had taught me in my high school in London, Ontario, and who had founded, and some of whom still taught in 1973, St. Patrick's College. It was the Francophone branch of the Oblates who, in fact, founded Ottawa U. Without the Oblates, it's unlikely that I would have become a psychologist. An Oblate psychologist who had studied at Duquesne University was a very early and important influence on me. And my first few years as an undergraduate led me to a deep appreciation of what is often facilely called the world of ideas, or the life of the mind, and I developed typically naive and romantic notions around this. I know now that if one has 1 or 2 original ideas that matter in a lifetime, one is very lucky indeed. One of the English professors at St. Patrick's was a personal friend of Marshall McLuhan's, so he was among the people we read, and we read such things as the following: education, which should be helping youth to understand and adapt to their revolutionary new environments, is instead being used merely as an instrument of cultural aggression, imposing upon re-tribalized youth the obsolescent visual values of the dying literate age. These were heady times indeed. Carleton, of course, had a notable history in psychology, even before the founding of the department. Henry Bowers is listed as the only instructor in 1942, but Florence Dunlop took over the course halfway through that first year. Dunlop, who would teach as the sole instructor for psychology courses at Carleton College until 1947, so that's 5 years, was a Columbia University graduate. And may I humbly ask, is there a Florence Dunlop Award that is given for some reason in this department? Should there not be one? Despite teaching here for the better part of a decade, Bob Wake would be the first department chair, perhaps because Dunlop was already 56 when the department was founded, or she was happy with her job at the school board. And it's nice to see that the Dunlop Public School in South Keys still exists. I don't know how many of you know, but it's named after that first instructor in this department. Brian Laver's early history of this department notes how many of the early lecturers were associated with the civil service or the armed forces. I was very surprised to discover among Carleton's early lecturers Dr. W.R.N. Blair, who would become the department head in psychology at the University of Calgary in the mid-1960s. Known to us as Buck Blair, or sometimes Colonel Blair, he was already retired when we arrived in Calgary, but his mythical tenure as head at Calgary was not only colorful, his reputation matches that, say, of someone like Bill Jones in his younger years. And I don't think I need to say more to at least some of you for you to understand what that means. But Carleton grew rapidly, as did so many post-war institutions in Canada. Carleton was a commuter campus, just like University of Calgary was. And part of that dream of post-war era to educate the vast, unwashed masses of baby boomers. But to return to my story, long before coming to main campus, I'm afraid that I had been tainted by the psychologists at St. Patrick's, which included Bill Walther, from whom I once borrowed, is he here? I'm sorry, he's not here, from whom I once borrowed Russell Jacoby's classic, Social Amnesia, a critique of contemporary psychology. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Russell Jacoby, the historian at UCLA, but it's quite a book. I'm sure he doesn't remember, but to be taking the basic curriculum on one hand and reading this kind of stuff was dangerous for one's intellectual balance. Likewise, a few years later, as a PhD student, Betty Bayer would casually lend me a copy of Seymour Saracen's Psychology Misdirected. I marveled at how a Yale professor was articulating doubts that I myself was then entertaining. But we were in some sense supported in our critical search by the faculty themselves. Lloyd Strickland, as Laurie already mentioned, and as has been mentioned several times today, organized that NATO conference in the early 70s on the crisis in social psychology, which resulted in the book entitled Social Psychology in Transition, which was floating around the department in various offices while we were graduate students. It should have had a warning label on it. This is bad for your mental health. I took a course in methods in social psychology as an undergraduate taught by John Barefoot, who certainly did his utmost to teach the tradition. But it was TA'd by Jill Morowski. If I received an ambiguous picture of research in social psychology, I certainly came by it honestly. While still at St. Patrick's, I enrolled in a practicum in community psychology, a course that was run by Don Andrews. Along with 3 students, I found myself in a year-long practicum placement in a halfway house for young men from 16 to 18 years. I don't remember very much about community psychology, but I learned a great deal about the Ottawa underworld and the shenanigans of charitable organizations for young criminals. A few months after we completed the practicum, the RCMP closed the entire operation down and charged a number of the employees. Years later, Don Andrews still marveled at how we had survived this placement. For my honors year, I moved to the main campus, and it was a more serious place. I met Nick Spanos at the end of his first year at Carleton, when he gave a guest lecture on hypnosis in a social psychology class. I took a course from him the following year and became his honors student. I was going to become a social worker and had already taken a part-time job with the Youth Services Bureau in Ottawa. To my surprise, Nick suggested I go to graduate school. So I thought, well, I'll try it for a year and see what happens. I had applied nowhere else, just Carleton. The lab was small in those days, a handful of honors students, a few graduate students. Laurie would be Nick's second PhD, I was his third. Nick had just published a major paper in Science on the Salem witchcraft trials. He would soon publish a paper in Psychological Bulletin on witchcraft histories and psychiatry. He was, of course, publishing a stream of papers at the same time on hypnosis in mainstream journals such as Journal of Personality and Social and the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. Indeed, he was so prolific that the Institute for Scientific Information in Philadelphia, the people who now run the Web of Science, ranked Nick as the 4th most productive psychologist in the world in the early 1980s. in the world. I remember that Ising was first, and I can't remember who was second and third. And for those who remember him, of course, you will surely remember his eccentricities. The lab, that's what we call it now, eccentricities. The lab frequently smelled like a barn because Nick would leave his chaps and horse riding accessories there. He and Bill Jones kept their horses at Kim Matheson's parents' place. And yes, we students would occasionally go out and ride with one or the other of those two. I recall meeting Kim when she was a high school student. One day, Bill Jones returned with Nick from one of their rides, and he was rather shaken. While riding along the side of a road, his horse had suddenly leaped in front of a school bus. We figured it was a murder-suicide plot on the part of the horse. Except Bill got away unscathed. The horse was killed. Their horses live on in infamy, though, because in one of their joint publications, Nick and Bill thank T.T. Horse and Kaiser W. III for their astute comments on a draft of the paper. T.T. Horse was Nick's horse, Ted the horse, and Kaiser Wilhelm III was Bill's horse. There were a fair share of irreverent pranks in those days, but I promised I would not tell any more tales out of school. We enjoyed going with Nick to visit his mother in Boston because his mother ran a decrepit little motel on the outskirts of the city. Nick came by his eccentricities honestly, I must say. We would stay at the motel, free of course, and wander around the city at will. I say we because by then Lori and I had started to live together. I met Lori in the lab course, and she was my TA for the graduate statistics course, in those days still a year-long course. Like Brenda Baird this morning, I failed the first test. To be fair, I was still completing my honors thesis in September and hadn't paid any attention to the fact that classes had started. But by the end of the course, in a class of about 25, I received the highest grade. For some years after, Dick Dillon used to expound to the graduate class on its first day of the year that there had been a student who had failed his first test and managed to get the highest grade in the course. Needless to say, I had some tutoring. Later, as a PhD student, I did have the pleasure of taking 2 half courses in mathematical psychology, one taught by Bill Jones and the other by Bill Petrusik. Somewhere in the mid to late 1980s, after I'd left here, long after I'd left here, I read a report of a study, at least it was reported by the APA, that indicated that a graduate education built on forwarding a particular point of view was a more robust and grounded education than one that was fair, even-handed, and took care to cover all sides. Donald Hebb was one of the individuals involved in that study. I can't find the study any longer, not even using modern techniques, search techniques, so I'm relying strictly on memory. We not only received such an education at Carleton, we thrived in the environment created by such directed rivalry. In recent conversations with some of our peers, it was clear that the 1970s were an unusual time to be a student at Carleton. It produced more than its share of academics with historical and theoretical interests. I'm thinking in particular of people like Joe Morowski, Betty Bayer, Ted Pallas, who've all gone to interesting and productive academic careers. In fact, all of us are nearing retirement. It's scary. There were others who spent time here as graduate students but did not complete PhDs here and are still very active in such communities, including people like Dale Stout, Ian Nicholson, and Tori Hoff. There was surely something in the water at the time that so many of us became interested in problems and topics broadly considered historical, critical, theoretical. Indeed, after having taken 2 history of psychology courses as an undergraduate here, I should qualify that. One of those history courses was Bill Petrusik's history of psychology, and that was really the history of psychophysics. I mean, having taken 2 history of psychology courses as an undergraduate and a course in psychoanalysis from David Bernhardt, and then working on a historical research project on the side as a graduate student, I simply began to take it for granted that history was just part of a general psychology education. In 1980, I spent half a year at the University of Western Ontario doing perceptual research with Gary Rollman. That was because the graduate dean at that particular time insisted that anyone doing 3 degrees at Carleton must spend at least a term somewhere else. And shortly after that, the graduate deans changed and that requirement disappeared. Although I enjoyed my time at Western, it was not at all like Carleton. Instead, it was far more staid and superficially professional. There's something to be said for that, of course. I'm not naively nostalgic. And it was already clear in the late 1970s that Carleton's Wild West psychology department was not going to stay that way forever. But something of the university that I later found in the words of Alfred North Whitehead was here when he said that the justification for a university is that it preserves a connection between knowledge and the zest for life by uniting the young and the old in the imaginative consideration of learning. Nick Spanos had both experimental and historical interests. And remember that despite his work at the Medfield State Hospital before he came here, he had a PhD in sociology. True, sometimes he could be divisive, focused on a particular point of view, and sometimes it was overly personal for him. But we learned to argue and to do studies that aimed to advance a particular point of view. As students, we wrote and published papers taking on the views of such well-known psychologists as Ernest Hilgard at Stanford, Martin Orrin at Pennsylvania, Ken Bowers at Waterloo. We then went to conferences where we presented such papers with them in the audience. I recall going to a meeting at the University of Chicago as a PhD student without Nick and being cornered by various senior professors and the like from places like Rutgers, Waterloo, and Stanford, and getting lectured and quizzed, and in one case, shouted at about Nick's lab, his articles, our work, and so on. And the more we were criticized in return, the more we were encouraged to do better work. Not that all of it was antagonistic, there were also allies. I will be forever grateful, for example, for having met as a graduate student Ted Sarbin of Berkeley, with whom I developed a lasting friendship for the remainder of his life. As a graduate advisor, I have never been able to do quite the same thing with my own students. I didn't have the fire in my belly, but something of the combative spirit that could focus precisely on a problem did remain with me. Of course, it goes without saying that not all was roses in the hypnosis lab, and some of you I know could tell a colorful story or two yourself. Bill and Elaine Petruzik's wise counsel, not to mention excellent meals, Bob Dylan and large quantities of wine, got me through my last year of my PhD program when Laurie had gone off to teach at the University of Manitoba. I must also thank, again, the support staff, such as Lynn Giff and Joan Drummond, who looked after us graduate students. We arrived in Calgary at a time when there were few jobs in psychology. Between us, we had probably interviewed at more than 10 schools, but Calgary looked like the best bet for 2 jobs. Laurie and I are now the 2 most senior people in our department, itself an odd experience. And I should add that was this Iowa connection at Carleton. We heard that several times this morning. The large group of people who were trained at Iowa ended up here. There was one important Iowa connection in Calgary as well. Robert Wyant, who created a whole string of history courses, then moved on to become a dean about the time that I arrived in Calgary. And I simply picked up all the history courses. In Calgary, however, we were never far from Carleton graduates. Our department head when we arrived in Calgary was Don Jameson, a Carleton PhD, who unfortunately moved to Western soon after, where he did marvelous things. Our current department head, as Laurie's already mentioned, was David Hodgins, a young student from Shawville, Quebec, who came to the hypnosis lab in the 1970s and completed his PhD later at Queen's. Sanjay Chandrasekararan, a recent Carleton PhD, was a postdoc in Calgary until 2011. And Laurie's mentioned Lauren Bertrand, a close friend from hypnosis day. Shortly after moving to Calgary, Lloyd Strickland passed through on a sabbatical and stopped for a colloquium. He would return later with Warren Thorngate to attend the psychology symposium we'd organized. Bill and Elaine Petruzik were regular visitors, while Don Jameson was still department head. We even offered Connie Christensen a job, when she completed her PhD, but she chose Carleton over us. I think what hurt the most was when I saw Connie a year or two later at CPA and we chatted about her visit. She said that all she could remember about the University of Calgary was the psychology building on campus. The building that houses the psychology department is a classic 1950s institutional two-story building, and granted, it was ugly. Connie said it looked like a bathroom. Well, Connie, I hope you will come and visit us again someday. The building has been thoroughly renovated. And I cannot recount the number of times I have met up with Fran Cherry at meetings in Canada and internationally, including the one here in 1995 that she and Warren Thorngate organized for the International Society of Theoretical Psychology. Fran has been an important colleague for both of us. And all I will say here is that if a particular Canadian historian of psychology who will go unnamed is giving a paper at a conference, and Fran and I are both in the same room, we need to sit far apart in order to keep from breaking into a serious attack of the giggles. Academic nudity was a term used in the 19th century to refer to appearing in public without a hood and gown. Well, I must thank you for this opportunity to engage in a moment of academic nudity. In some ways, I still cannot believe the sheer good fortune I had in arriving here when I did. And I hope there's still a little of that iconoclasm in this place, and the sheer drivenness to make a difference as our universities begin to resemble each other more and become efficient corporations. If I can go back to Whitehead and his notion of the imaginative consideration of learning, he also said that when we illuminate facts with imagination, a fact is no longer a bare fact. It is invested with all its possibilities. It is no longer a burden on the memory. It is energizing as the poet of our dreams and as the architect of our purposes. Thank you.